Will he or won't he? Donald Trump now planning, and his adversaries bracing for, a series of dramatic changes that he has promised on day one of his presidency. Mass deportation of migrants that we talked about, make his criminal cases and those of January 6th rioters go away, use the Justice Department against his enemies, a massive purge of federal workers, rolling back protections for transgender students, all of them things the president-elect has prioritized and promised.
You are promising America tonight you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one. I love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator.
The New York Times also reports that the president-elect is being pulled in opposite directions by his advisors, some encouraging him to go after his political foes, others encouraging him to focus on policy instead. Ken Dilanian is our justice and intelligence correspondent. Peter Nicholas is senior White House reporter for NBC News Digital. And Harry Litman is a former U.S. attorney who served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Clinton administration. Great to have all of you here. Ken, you've been reporting that some of Trump's top legal allies, including one who's seen as a potential attorney general, they're calling for the DOJ to begin prosecuting his adversaries. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. The tension you described that the New York Times reported on within the transition team was described to us as a battle between the normies and the crazies, although, of course, the people we're talking about would disagree with that characterization. We focused on a couple of lawyers. One's named Mike Davis. He's a very conservative, kind of a bomb-throwing provocateur who used to clerk for Justice Neil Gorsuch. He's an advisor to the transition team, and he has been out there publicly saying that Donald Trump should prosecute people like the Attorney General Tish James and Jack Smith, the special counsel, that his Justice Department should do that. He's actually articulating which crimes they should be prosecuted for, and he's making no bones about that. The other person we talked about is Mark Paoletta. He is the former general counsel of the Office of Management and Budget in Donald Trump's first term, and he has been out there not specifically advocating that the DOJ should prosecute individuals, but he is justifying the idea that the president can order the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute specific cases. So he's laying the legal groundwork. Now, the thing about that is that would violate 5 decades of norms post-Watergate, which said that the Justice Department should be independent from the president, that the president should never say, go investigate that person. These people are suggesting that Donald Trump should be able to do that with his Justice Department. And as a legal matter, they're right. We're talking about norms here, not laws, these post-Watergate strictures. And so it's raising a lot of questions and getting a lot of people very nervous. The one thing I would say is we should wait and see exactly who gets appointed to these roles and what exactly they're going to do, because, you know, it's very easy for people to throw rhetorical bombs at this stage of the game. We'll have to see exactly what happens, Chris.
Yeah, we'll see whether the norms versus crazies shakes out in any predictable way, Harry. But obviously, it's not just Mark Paoletta and Mike Davis, a lot of names out there. As someone who's been Deputy Assistant Attorney General, give us your view. What do names like these tell you?
Well, especially, as Ken says, with what Paoletta is now enunciating, he really is laying the groundwork, and I think it will be laid by January 20th to have Trump interfere in individual prosecutions. That, for any alum of DOJ, Republican, Democratic administration, doesn't matter, is absolutely a third rail that could never happen. And yet I think it's quite clear that they are preparing to do it. And Trump has been adamant, including on the campaign trail, that he would use it to go after particular folks. I think it's true, as Ken says, we don't know how robust this will be, but people like Tish James, people like Jack Smith are involved in current battles with the president that he will want to try to squash if he can. So I think it would be foolish to assume that this won't happen. They're already laying the groundwork for it, and I think we'll see it executed in at least a few instances of prosecutions against political enemies, even in the absence of any meritorious charges.
In fact, Peter, you report on some of the nervousness among Trump's vocal critics, some of whom he's referred to, as we've all heard, referred to them as the enemy within. Tell us more about that.
Well, there are people who are quite concerned. They've listened to Trump's rhetoric. They've been publicly critical of Trump. And some are consulting with lawyers, looking for advice about how to protect themselves. We've talked to people who say there are plans afoot to leave the country until they have a better idea of what Trump intends to do. Trump could do a lot, short of prosecutions. For example, his administration could strip people of their security clearances. Those clearances are often used by former government employees to obtain jobs, to get contracts. They're important to their livelihoods, and Trump could take them away. So there are many, he has vast powers as commander-in-chief and chief executive, and there are many ways that he could target people for reprisal. I would just say that he has said different things on this subject. There are times when he has said that success would be his revenge, and there are other times where he's described the enemy within in reference to Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, Congressman Adam Schiff. So he has, it depends on what you believe and how you construe his statements, but people are quite concerned heading into these uncharted waters.
And we're hearing different things from people, Harry, who are in the general circle of Donald Trump. And yesterday, Congressman Jim Jordan was asked about the potential for Trump to seek retribution. Here's what he said.
What you are saying is that all of the times that President Trump said so many things about people that he promised that he would go after them and prosecute them, you were going to encourage him not to do that?
Well, all I know is what he didn't do.
I know, but we're talking about
lock her up. He's talking about his opponent in 2016, Secretary Clinton, talked about lock her up. He didn't do that. He didn't go. But the Democrats went after him.
I know, but I'm talking about Donald Trump's second term. Going forward. Since then, he has said many times.
I don't think any of that's going to happen because we're the party who's against political prosecution.
And Harry and Peter just pointed this out, from the enemy within to my revenge will be success. But I wonder what kinds of conversations might be going on now within DOJ from people who are, I'm sure, anxious and waiting and wondering what the impact will be on them and their ability to do their jobs if they keep their jobs.
Totally. And that's a whole different aspect of the potential reign of terror that people are afraid of. There are individual prosecutions against some folks. And I would just add that he's going to cede the department, and there will be people in Congress with people who will encourage both his to have these powers and to exercise them. A whole different problem, though, is the career staff, the kind of crown jewel of the DOJ, will be forced to, notwithstanding their oath, to try to be make their first priority loyalty to Donald Trump. And that just eviscerates what they came there for. So we're not talking necessarily about people who have to lawyer up, though it's a really important point. You can make somebody spend a lot of money, ruin their lives, short of criminal prosecutions. But we're talking about a whole staff that thinks, this is not going to be the Department of Justice I signed on to. I don't want to be here anymore, and I'm even afraid to be here. I can tell you personally, those conversations are happening in the corners, at the water coolers, outside the DOJ, and they're proliferating every day.